we'll make a new drawing named Drop Shadow, add a layer to it, then add a rounded rectangle shape to that layer. To add a drop shadow, select the layer the rounded rectangle is on, pull down on the FX icon and select Drop Shadow. This brings up the same layer style dialog we saw before, but with the drop shadow effect checked and selected so we can see its parameters. This applies a drop shadow with its default parameters. Out of the box, the default parameters make a small drop shadow that you can see on the right and bottom edges of the rounded rectangles. You can change the default settings, but you will probably find that saving effects as a style is a better way to manage things. The drop shadow affects the right and bottom edges because the angle parameter is set to 120 degrees, and the rectangle is floating above the background layer below it. The angle parameter determines the direction of the light. The light is always coming from an infinite distance away. 120 degrees means the light is coming from a bit to the left of the middle of the top of the drawing. You can direct enter the angle, or you can move the line in the circle next to the angle value, or select the value of the angle using the up and down arrow keys to increase or decrease it. Typically, global light should be checked, but we'll get to what this does shortly. Light at 0 degrees comes in from the right side of the drawing and makes the shadow appear along the left edge of the rounded rectangle. Light at 90 degrees comes in from the top of the drawing and makes the shadow appear along the bottom edge of the rounded rectangle. Light at 120 degrees simulates having light come in from a window slightly to your left as you are drawing on the canvas. Drop shadow makes a copy of the shape it's applied to, but with a fill color selected in the layer style dialog. You can use your palette of colors to set this. For example, double-click on the color to bring up the color picker. Then click on the palette icon to fly out the color palette and click on highlight. Now we have a small highlight colored drop shadow. The drop shadow effect doesn't draw a stroke for the copy it makes, and it typically blurs the edges of the copy. However, because the template for it, in this case a rounded rectangle, is drawn on top of the shadow, it's hard to see the details of what the effect is doing. In fact, this is the case for all effects. The template often makes it hard to see how the parameters for the effect produce a visual result. I like to say visual effect, but that would overload the term too much. A handy thing to do to make it easier to understand things when you are trying to figure out what all the parameters for an effect do is to make the fill transparent by setting the fill for the layer to 0 and then setting the stroke to 1. This leaves just an outline of what we're going to call the template shape. However, even though we have made the fill transparent, in this case we can't see the duplicate the drop shadow effect has drawn. This has to do with the particular way the drop shadow effect works, because when you make a fill somewhat transparent, you don't want to see the shadow underneath of it. However, you can change this behavior by unchecking the Layer Knocks Out Drop Shadow property. Once you do that, you can see the whole duplicate of the shape template that the drop shadow effect has created and its position relative to the shape template. To make it easier to see, zoom up the size and reposition the drawing. The course video isn't quite big enough to show everything, so we'll move the layer style dialog in and out of the frame as we use it. Now it's a bit easier to see that the drop shadow effect has duplicated the shape template, but blurred its edges a little bit. The spread parameter determines how much the edge of the shadow is blurred. This parameter would be better named hardness because it is setting the hardness of the edge of the shadow. An edge that is 100% hard has no blur at all, that is, a clearly defined edge, much like a hard pencil draws a line with a clearly defined edge. 0% makes the edge soft, that is, blurred as possible, again, very much like a soft pencil draws an indistinct line. For now, we'll set it to 100% so the edge is hard, because that will make it easier to see what the other parameters do. Later, we will come back and soften it up a bit. Now, it is really easy to see that the drop shadow effect has drawn a slightly offset rectangle. However, the rectangle is a bit larger than the shape template. The size of the rectangle is determined by, drumroll, the size property. It's measured in pixels and is how much the edge is pushed out from the center. So, in the case of the rectangle shape template, 2 times the drop shadow size is added to the width and height to make the shadow rectangle. You can make the shape quite large, but at some point the algorithm that copies the rounded corners breaks down. In any case, unless you are trying for some artistic effect, the size usually is not that big. Now let's get back to the spread. As we decrease the spread or hardness, the edge of the shadow blurs more, and 0 is its maximum blur. The quality setting determines the look of the shadow. The contour determines the overall shape of the blur, but a simple linear slope works well for a shadow-like appearance. If you double-click the contour, it will open to an editor that you can use to make a custom shape. Anti-alias will help clean up edges in some cases. Noise randomly mixes in some background pixels and gives the shadow a grainy appearance. We'll set it to 50% now just to see how it works. The last parameter we'll work with is distance. The shadow is offset from the shape template. The amount of that offset is determined by the angle and distance parameters. It's easier to think of offset in terms of x and y offset, that is in rectangular coordinates, but the drop shadow effect uses polar coordinates. So the distance moves the shadow away from the light. If we change the distance to 15, the shadow moves down and to the right, away from the 120-degree lighting source. Now we have a highlight colored shadow, which doesn't really look all that good. Let's change the shadow into blue stroke. The offset of the shadow doesn't look quite right either. It's hard to place a shadow by number. You can adjust the position of the shadow by eye by using the mouse. To do this, you need to have the Layer Style dialog open with Drop Shadow selected. Once you've done that, click and drag anywhere on the layer to move the shadow relative to the rectangle. Notice that two things are changing in the dialog, the angle and the distance. But the key with this technique is that you can position the shadow by eye. One last parameter to look at, and that is global light. To do that, we're going to another layer with a rectangle and copy the drop shadow effect to it. Once that is done, open the Layer Style dialog for the drop shadow on that layer. Now change the angle to 45 degrees. Notice that the angle changed for both layers. That is why it is a global light, because it is shared by all the layers in the drawing. Now adjust the position of the shadow on the new rectangle by eye. Notice that both rectangles are adjusted. Now adjust the distance of the new rectangle. Notice that the distance of the first rectangle does not change. This keeps the angle of the global light the same for all layers, but in effect lets you change the apparent distance the rectangle is from the background independently. Now uncheck Use Global Light. When you do that, the angle reverts to its default value 120, but it has no effect on the first rectangle we added. If we do some by eye adjustments to the shadow now, it has no effect on the first rectangle we made either. So how do you set the default value for the angle? You do it with the application menu, but you cannot have any drawings open when you do this. So close all the drawings, go to the application menu, Layer Style, Global Light. There you will see a default value of 120. Change it to 60. There is also an altitude, but that is meant for use with the 3D features of Photoshop, and this course is sticking to a flat 2D world. So for drop shadow, the altitude doesn't mean anything. The new value for the global light angle will only affect new drawings, not existing ones. So click OK, open a new drawing, call it Drop Shadow 3, add a layer, add a rectangle with the drop shadow, then open the Layer Style dialog for the drop shadow, and you will see a 60-degree default value. We have drilled into the details of many things you can do with the drop shadow effect. But for technical drawings, keeping things simple is probably your best strategy. So 120-degree global light, no noise, color matches stroke, linear fall off, 0 spread, and a distance between 5 or 10 pixels, or maybe set by eye.